Welcome to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made Show with Dr. June. I am elated that you are joining me today as we explore holistic health and wellness with a biblical spin. This show is for informational purposes only, and I look forward to serving you. Hello, this is Dr. June. Welcome back. Listen, I wanted to start this show with first principles because that's what I've had to do. I want to take you along my journey so you can understand where all this is coming from. My expertise, my heart, my why. See, I was born and raised in Uganda, this beautiful small country in East Africa, in the 90s when the whole country was plagued with AIDS. And this is not just my whole country, it was my house too. It was my home. My first memory was actually of me counting my father's ribs as he was ill, and he was so slim that his ribs were so visible. And actually in Uganda growing up, we used to call AIDS slim because people were so characteristically slim or cachectic. My second memory was the day of my father's death, and my mother, who is the strongest and wisest and most amazing woman alive. She got her children, her 4 children, my 3 sisters and I, and she gathered us around my father's deathbed, and we all knelt down, and his body just lay there lifeless, and there was a white sheet over his body, and she made us all kneel down, and she said a prayer, and this prayer changed my life. She said, "God, these children are not orphans. These children are yours. I give them to you. You are their father." In that moment, something clicked. My 5-year-old brain understood that although my father, my earthly father, was dead because I could see him lifeless, that I had adopted a new father, God, the creator of the universe. And that somehow gave me such comfort, knowing that God, the creator, was with me, was with us, and I knew that everything was going to be okay in that moment. Over the years, I saw how AIDS really affected every home in the country, including my own. I remember watching my Aunt Margaret get sick and die in our home, and my Aunt Sarah, and every time somebody visited, the first thought in everyone's mind was, oh my goodness, who died? It was like death hovered over the whole country, over every village, every town, every home. At a time, I remember we were at a burial, at least one burial every week. And in that season, I knew in my soul that God called me to be a doctor and a healer. I also understood that my mother, my sister, who was 2.5 years old when my father died, and I were likely sick and were going to die. So I prayed to my dad. I prayed to God. And I said, God, please, I pray, let me become a doctor. But 2, let me be a doctor so that I can take care of my mom when her time comes, so I can be her doctor. And through a series of miracles I cannot even get into today, this God, my father, orchestrated. I ended up in the United States at a prestigious high school on full scholarship. And from there, I went to my dream school, the Johns Hopkins University, where I studied neuroscience and also fell in love with public health. Also on full scholarship by the grace of God. And after that, God orchestrated in His might for me to go to the Duke University School of Medicine on scholarship, where I was filled with wonder every time I opened a book or went to class. I mean, I saw God everywhere. I saw his finger on creation, from, the hairs in our heads to our brains that are encased in the skull, and these eyes as they sit in the orbital socket, and the gut, which is not just important for digestion, but is also part of our immune system, or our toes, which take us everywhere. I was in awe of the Creator. I was in awe of my dad. And it made me think about, how celebrities have children. I felt like this is probably how celebrities' children feel, right? They are at home, they live with their dad or their mom who's a celebrity. It's just mom and dad. And then you go out into the world and you see your father on a poster somewhere, and you see his work, and you're like, oh my goodness, dad is famous. This is how I felt in medical school. Like, oh my goodness, my dad, the creator of this human body, is so good. He's famous. He's the one who made the human body. But no one talked about him. It was like this huge elephant in the room. I had all these experts in physiology and pathophysiology, and the medical school I went to was huge on highly specialized fields, treat very rare diseases. We had people flying in from all over the world to come be seen by our doctors, like bubble syndrome, all of these rare diseases. And I thought about how all these great minds in medicine had come together, this great institution, with the goal to study, to learn, to teach the mechanics of the wonder that is the human body. But there was no mention of him. No mention of the Creator, not even an honorable mention of the Creator. And it blew my mind. I remember being on my neurosurgery rotation and being in this awake craniotomy. So this is a surgery where the patient is put to sleep and woken up in the middle of the surgery. What happens is, say the patient has a lesion, a tumor, or an epileptic focus that is very close to a special part of the body. So if patient had a lesion that is near their language center, Broca's area, and so we had to go in and map the area where the lesion was to make sure that that the neurosurgeon was not going to perform surgery and affect the patient's language. And so the patient was woken up after the scalp had been pulled back and the skull was removed, and now here we are looking at the human brain, right? And the neurosurgeon has this electrode and is touching different parts of the brain, and the patient is awake now and talking to the neurologist because this patient was multilingual, and so we had to make sure that the neurosurgeon was not going to take out a part of the brain that was responsible for not just one of his languages but multiple languages. And so we had the neurologist linguist sitting with cards and asking the patient about, what is this, to make sure that the patient did not lose their language ability, because they needed their language ability for their job. That blew my mind completely. And I remember at some point the neurosurgeon touching a part of the brain and the patient's arm moving, and it just made me worship God even more. It's so amazing how grand and how intricate God has made these human bodies, and what wonder I have felt and what awe I have felt just watching the human body operate. And it's really interesting because the human brain, which is a big part of the nervous system, so the nervous system in the human is the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. And the nervous system is important in helping us understand the world around us, right? So getting all of this sensory stimuli going in through the sensory nerves, going into the brain processes what's going on in the environment and then helps us understand that and helps us to react. But the brain, which is responsible for this sensory input, for understanding the world around us, for feeling, right, does not have sensation itself. So someone can touch somebody's brain and the patient not know it. That just blew my mind. I remember being in an open abdominal surgery, assisting, of course, and having my hands in the patient's bowel and feeling the warmth of the patient's small bowel as it peristalsed, as it moved on its own. Now, the patient was on the table, sedated, intubated. The patient had no idea what we were doing at that point in time, but the patient's gut knew that it still had to move. It was an involuntary thing that the body just knows how to do. The kidneys were still making urine, although the patient was asleep and dead to the world. How great God is. Oh, I remember being in the ER as a medical student and being in the hustle and bustle and stabilizing all these very sick patients and quote unquote pulling people from the jaws of death. And the miracle that is, and there was still no mention of God. And it blew my mind. It was actually more like taboo. You know, how can you learn so much? How can you be so learned and still believe in God? In my mind, I thought, how can you not? How can you not see God in everything? It makes me think about this rice cooker analogy that I use quite often. How I have this complex rice cooker that was gifted to me. It's a crock pot, it's a canner, it's a steamer, it can saute, and how it's taken me some time to figure out what it actually does and what setting I can use for different kinds of foods. And it makes me think that if it breaks, and it's special to me, I wouldn't want to throw it out. First thing I would do is try and troubleshoot it on my own, right? Get the manual. The manuals usually say, you know, for troubleshooting, if this happens, then that, and try all those things. And if that doesn't help, then try getting some outside help, like on YouTube, our favorite consultant, or doing some online research. And then if that fails, finding an appliance repair person. You have to pay money for that one. Right? Someone who has studied electronics, who can probably look up the serial number, go to the manufacturer's website. This person usually looks it over, makes a diagnosis, performs whatever treatment, whatever surgeries they have to do, and then return it back to me at a price, right? But that's just my rice cooker that is dear to me. Imagine a machine much more valuable than a rice cooker, which can be replaced easily, right? Made me think of, you know, expensive cars. I was thinking about like the Rolls Royce. You know, they make about $3,000 to $5,000 a year. So it's a specialty item, but still quite common, right? And I was looking at, there's a car called the Rolls Royce Sweptail. This car was custom made. It's a one of a kind. And it cost a whopping $13 million US. Now this car, its design is based on various yachts with inspiration from various classic cars from the early 20th century, and is so fancy with ebony and all of these very special items. I imagine that the person who commissioned for this car to be made definitely has a lot of money, but also they are probably on a first name basis with someone at the Rolls-Royce headquarters. And if something happened to their Rolls-Royce Sweptail, the one-of-a-kind car, they would not drive it down to the Ferrari dealership or even the Rolls-Royce dealership. They would probably call Tony at the Rolls-Royce headquarters and say, hey, the Sweptail has had an issue, right? But many of us treat our bodies like we're, you know, maybe some Ferrari, some of us treat our bodies like maybe we're a Range Rover, but many of us are treating our bodies like they're Toyotas or Hondas or just some machine that is not as valuable. But we the mechanics of the human machine, we study manuals that are written by other students of the human body, maybe ancient students. We're from antiquity, right? But still, we're studying works by students. What about the master manual? We're not really studying that. Or better still, if we have access to the manufacturer, why don't we use that? So anyway, after medical school, I went to residency in emergency medicine, which I absolutely loved. I trained at Grady Emory in Atlanta, and I loved it. I even actually went and got my master's degree in global health, and I started working in the United States as an ER physician, as an ER attending. And I love the emergency room. It is fast-paced. You think on your feet. You manage multiple sick and critical patients and their families. And I manage a team that consists of many different people. There's nurses and techs and environmental services and consultants and physician assistants and nurse practitioners and all of these people. But primarily, I work with the patients, right? Making a diagnosis. If someone comes in with a complaint, is this an emergency? Yes or no? If it is, even if it's not, right, stabilize the emergency. Usually that involves treatment, and then eventually facilitate management of this disease process, management of the patient, right? If they're critically ill, they're intubated and sedated, they usually go to the ICU. If they are sick but not so sick and they're stable, and they can go to the floor in the hospitalist can manage them. If they're sick enough to go home, and we love this, we send them home, right? But it felt like over time I began to feel like I was a drug dealer with a license. Let me explain. Let me expound. Someone comes in with an issue. Many times, it's a symptom. We'll treat the symptom, or if we're lucky, we get to the root cause, and there's a pill for that. Doctor, I have this problem. Well, there's a pill for that. Doctor, I have this other problem. There's a pill for that. Doctor, I have this problem. This is actually the side effect of the pill that some other doctor or even I gave you months ago. Well, there's a pill for that. And it just felt like I was not really getting to the root cause of the disease, the root cause of the ailments that my patients were suffering from. As a physician, I am called to help alleviate suffering. And it just felt like I was just treating symptoms and not really getting to the root cause. Now, the system has a lot to do with this, right? So I'm in the emergency room. Let's say I'm working at night and I'm the only person there. And someone comes in and we discover that they're having acid reflux, let's say. There is not enough time for me to sit down with my patient and say, hey, you have acid reflux. Let's talk about what you're eating, why you're eating, what you're eating, when you're eating, right? How close to bedtime are you eating? Why are you eating what you're eating? And all of these things. And so over time, that began to eat at me and gnaw at me, and I went back to first principles, which is why this is called first principles. I went back to God, to Genesis, and I asked God, is this it? Is this what you called me to do? All of those years when I was struggling and watching people die left, right, and center, you called me to be a healer. Is this it? And as I asked God, He answered me and said, sit down at my feet and I will teach you how to heal my people. So I opened the manual, the Bible. I spoke with the manufacturer. I still do. And I have been learning about true healing and wellness according to the manufacturer. True healing is holistic. It is body, soul, and spirit. We are really good in Western medicine at treating the body. But what about the soul? The soul is the mind, the will, and the emotions. The mind and the emotions, psychology, psychiatry handles that. What about the will? What about the spirit? Friends, healing is not apart from God. True healing is with God. Exodus 15:26, God Himself says, I am Jehovah Rapha. I am the Lord that healeth thee. He called Himself that. And He has been teaching me healing with Him. with access to the Creator. When I think about that awake craniotomy, I could not help but acknowledge the goodness and the grandeur of God. You know, Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. I have been blessed to be learned in conventional Western medicine, but also, and if not more importantly, learning from the Creator himself. You know, it's like a mechanic going to learn about, the Rolls Royce and going to the Rolls Royce dealership and working at the dealership versus going to headquarters, right? And I have been conflicted for a long time regarding these two, regarding Western medicine that I am an expert in, emergency medicine, and God's medicine, true healing, because I felt like I could not talk about God in academia, in medicine, right? There was this shame of being a Christian, or, how can you be so learned to study medicine at the great institutions of the world and still believe in God? You have to be a fool or just stupid to believe in God. After all we've discovered about the human body. That's the overarching sentiment in medicine. But Psalm 14:1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. But God, this God, the Creator God, is not just God to me. He is my Father, like I explained to you, from when I was 5 years old. So I can't imagine having to exclude him from this facet of my life, healing, that takes up so much of my time. Well, I was made for such a time as this, right? I got to this tipping point where I began to realize that I'm a Christian first. And I'm a daughter, and I'm a doctor, and I'm a sister, and I'm a friend. But at the end of the day, I am the creation of my Creator. And this show has been born out of that for such a time as this, to show you that we as humans truly are fearfully and wonderfully made, and to show you that science is not anti-God, it's not anti-God. It's actually man's attempt to understand God's creation, and true science only discovers what God has already made, and it cannot upstage him. Science and faith, they're not at loggerheads. Science is faith in man's ability to understand the works of the Creator. Science is man's attempt at understanding the mind of the Creator. You see, the mechanic can never upstage the manufacturer. As a mechanic or a doctor of the human body, I've had the privilege to access the manufacturer, the Creator, and I'd love to show you what I have learned about health and healing from these different schools of thought or healing. You see, the human body, to learn about the human body is to take a peek at the mind of the Creator and seeing his love, his grandeur, his magnificence in his design. I imagine the team at Rolls-Royce is so proud of their creations, their 3,000 to 5,000 cars that they that they produce every year. But I imagine that the team that made the Sweptail has that on their resume, that one-of-a-kind car. You, my friend, are on God's resume. You are a one-of-a-kind creation that even the Rolls-Royce Sweptail cannot stand up to. It does not compare to the magnificence that is you. So join me as we explore true health and healing and wellness and all things God. Welcome to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made Show with Dr. June. Thank you for tuning in to the Fearfully and Wonderfully Made show with Dr. June. See you next week. Until then, friends, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.